want to thank you all for coming out this evening. What I want to talk to you about, my idea really is engaging with this concept of our moral DNA. When I talk about DNA, I don't mean it in the sense that scientists talk about DNA, but I'm ultimately talking about our dreams, how we nurture those dreams, and ultimately how we act upon them when we find ourselves in those moments when our democracy is challenged. Right now, and give you some conventional wisdom, if you knew me, you'd know how strange it is that I'm quoting Anton Scalia, but when in Rome. So Anton Scalia says that the Constitution or any text should not be interpreted strictly or sloppily. It should be interpreted reasonably. And what I'm going to offer to you this afternoon is a reasonable interpretation of our founding documents and how they make up collectively what we find as the roots of our DNA. Right now in Hong Kong, they're protesting in the streets for democracy. And it's interesting because this image, which was released this weekend, came in response to the beating of a journalist. And here are these young people in Hong Kong saying collectively, they can't kill us all. And yet, even as we're watching this protest taking place in Hong Kong, in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, here in the arsenal of democracy, we see the frustration of democracy, the frustration of our dreams. I say that because I graduated from high school in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, and there was a professor in Tiananmen Square in 1989, a guy by the name of George Jachanowicz, who actually wrote a memoir of what was taking place there. And I got to share this with you because it's powerful. Jachanowicz said, on May 13th, the hunger strike began in Tiananmen Square. Somehow that was a catalyst. More and more thoughts began to cross the line. Marx was replaced by Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and Martin Luther King. Never had I expected to see a Chinese student in Tiananmen Square with a headband bearing the English words, "I have a dream." It's interesting that wherever in the world people talk about liberty, equality, democracy, they find our founding documents and they find our intersections, our turning points in history. But he continued, and this is powerful. When workers joined the demonstrations to success few had dared to hope for, the students lost their ideological nerve. Those demonstrating for due process and separation of powers stood side by side with those who admired Mao. Together they faced down the army in the wee hours of May 21st and held control of Peking. "You've won," I told my Chinese friends. "The army is disobeyed." "The army will never disobey," they replied. "This is China." My Chinese friends were right. The Chinese government is not designed to respond to public opinion. There is no way orderly change can occur in a totalitarian society. Herblock captured that brilliantly in this cartoon from 1989 because China can call itself the People's Republic, but at the end of the day, the People's Republic is the United States, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That is in our DNA, and when we see certain things on the global scale, we respond because it speaks to our DNA. In fact, the National Council for the Social Studies identifies what they call the core democratic values for elementary students. And I want to say this to you early, and I'll say it often. You're not going to find core democratic values in the Constitution, not Article 1, Section 8. Where you find core democratic values is in the aspirational language of the Declaration and the preamble. It's not what we are, it's what we aspire to be. The first three are powerful. The first one says, life, pursuit of happiness, liberty, justice, popular sovereignty, the power of the government comes from the people. Truth, the government and citizens should not lie. Common good, equality, diversity, and patriotism. Core democratic values. And again, as I mentioned, you find those in this aspirational language that we find in the preamble. Christopher Eisgruber, who is at Princeton University, has argued that American government aspires to be both democratic and just. But here's the problem. Can justice and democracy coincide? If the majority rules, can you really have justice? Eisgruber says, look, this makes heavy, but we may hope not impossible demands upon the American people. Until evidence forces us to give up the hope for a just democracy, the constitutional enterprise compels us to treat that hope as reasonable. And when people believe that the hope for a just democracy is real, do you know what they do? They forge ahead into intersections. Rosa Parks would never have given up her seat on that bus in Montgomery if she didn't believe that it was reasonable that she could change the hearts and minds of Americans, the people of Montgomery. Martin Luther King doesn't make the I Have a Dream speech if he doesn't believe that it's reasonable that you can change the hearts and minds of Americans. And that's why this moment is so powerful for us, because when we see things like this on the international stage, it really draws us to the quick. We awaken very quickly. We can see in this the inherent evil, the denial of rights, the violence, the denial of gender equality. But what blows me away is that we can't make that comparison when we see the frustration of democracy on the streets of American City. Tiananmen Square in 1989, Ferguson 2014. Where is our frustration and sense of moral outrage that our democracy is in jeopardy in Ferguson? Where is our sense of moral outrage that those things that we hold dear, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, popular sovereignty, are being frustrated on the streets of American City, and yet people seem almost anesthetized to what's taking place in Missouri? When you have police officers that look like they're occupying a city in the Middle East as opposed to the United States, where's our sense of moral outrage? Why hasn't our DNA kicked in? When we see laws like Stand Your Ground that mock the very foundational idea that the purpose of government is to preserve life, where's our sense of moral outrage? When we look at Occupy Wall Street and we ask ourselves how our values have been sold out to corporations, how our schools have been sold out to corporations, how the very essence of American democracy in some sense is in question in housing, in education, in the policing of our cities, and there's no moral outrage, we have this moment where we really need to reclaim our DNA. I want to talk about that because so many American tragedies are born of that frustration. And I could talk about these in so many different ways, but I want to deal with two with you very quickly. Trayvon Martin and Christina Green. We've lost the fine art of statecraft in the United States. We've lost the ability to talk to each other and to have conversations that at the end of the day are rooted in our desire to strengthen and deepen our democracy, not to win a political point. We find ourselves at a crossroads when, if we look back at our history, we celebrate the fact that the Scottsboro Boys ultimately got off. We celebrate the fact that we had a Civil War and Reconstruction, and at the end of that Civil War and Reconstruction, you got a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and emancipation. It may have taken 100 years, but ultimately, you got a Civil Rights Act of 1964 and a Voting Rights Act of 1965, and you got equality. We can talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911 and the denial of the right to vote for women. And we can talk about how women ultimately won the right to vote in 1920. But still, it took to the 1960s for women and a women's movement to win the actual recognition. And even today, women find themselves in a situation where they're still lagging behind men on those object measures of success. But where's our sense of moral outrage? If it were the Middle East, we'd be ready to go to war. On questions of justice, on questions of race, on questions of class, on questions of gender, we find ourselves in a moment where literally we are in an intersection. I want to explain to you what I mean by that. Imagine that you are pulling up to a four-cornered intersection in the town in which you live, and all the power is going out in the city. And there's no logical authority there to reestablish who's supposed to go first. No police, no firemen. What are you supposed to do? As you sit at that intersection, you're confronted with three choices. You can be on go, you can be on stop, or you can be on caution. Now, of course, there are consequences for each one of those decisions. If you're on go, if you move into that intersection, the benefit is that you just might get home before everyone else. Or you can pull into that intersection and you can find yourself in the midst of an accident. Now, whether that accident is a fender bender or a fatality, all depends on what other people are doing in that intersection. You can be on caution. I would submit to you that Abraham Lincoln spends most of the Civil War on caution. Writes the Emancipation Proclamation, puts it in a desk, waits for victory. Or you can be on stop. I would suggest that the loyalists during the American Revolution are on stop. What do you mean we're leaving England? We can't do that. But where are we at present? When the very essence of our democratic ideals are in jeopardy in our schools, in our social structures, in the way that we look at and treat people who are different than us. When we talk about equality, marriage and the family, when we talk about racial justice, when we talk about gender equality, where is our sense of outrage? We would assume that it would be the strongest when we were talking about the loss of life associated with young people. It's why I said when we looked at those American tragedies earlier that Trayvon Martin and Christina Green speak so powerfully to us. Two young people cut down in their prime. One in an act of, political violence, if that's what you want to call what happened in Arizona, and the other in an act of a person who believed that because of this immoral law in Florida, stand your ground, that he had the right to take a life. Both of them facilitated by the easy access to guns in this country. Martin Luther King, in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, wrote very powerfully that during the civil rights movement, they made a grievous error. And that error was compounded by the fact that they became so interested in winning equality of opportunity, they lost sight of the larger issues that ultimately divide people. And I want to be very clear about what he said. He said, what good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. What good is it to have the right to go to college if you can't afford tuition? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. I would submit to you that having a political DNA that enables us to say and have people all over the world look at us when they are struggling for those things that we take for granted, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that we have no sense of moral outrage when those things that are so central to our identity are in jeopardy, is an outrage. The title of my presentation was From Helix to Healing, and I began by talking about DNA. The interesting thing about the helix is that it's a double helix, and what it shows is that our fates, our destinies are intertwined. Not until we realize that ultimately injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, then we will continually be in a position where it's only aspirational language and not real equality that we stand to achieve. At the end of the day, people are happy and they love promoting the idea of it takes a village. Let me be very clear with this audience. We are the village. We are the people. And if we're going to perfect this union, and if we hope to continue to be a beacon of light and hope to other nations, to live up to Hong Kong students still projecting their message in English because they believe, perhaps more profoundly than we do, in our own foundational issues, our own foundational doctrines, then we have to accept and reclaim our moral DNA. Thank you.